There are many reasons why we love the keyboard hobby, and today I wanted to introduce you to one of mine. Prototype keyboards and helping keyboard designers by joining prototype runs. Now, it's not risk-free, and one should weigh the pros and cons of joining a prototype run, so I encourage you to pay attention to the disclaimer portion of this video. But for me, at least in my opinion, it's well worth it, as long as you do your homework. I know that there are prototype runs for keycaps, switches, and other cool things in our keyboard hobby, but for this video, I'll be focusing only on keyboards. Also, please know that not every prototype run will be handled the same way, and even if you do all you can to make sure that you won't be disappointed with the prototype unit by asking questions and by vetting the designer, do know that the word prototype makes it pretty clear that the actual public run units will probably be more polished than the prototypes, and prototypes are just for testing. Of course, they should be functional at the end of the day, but we'll get into that later on in the video. Without further ado, please allow me to explain the 3 reasons why one of my favorite aspects of the keyboard hobby is joining prototype runs. I want to make myself very clear. An opportunity to join a prototype run can be exciting, but it's not without risks. I'll touch upon this more in the cons section of this video, but just know that on top of the usual issues that may arise when it comes to joining group buys, such as logistical delays, prototype runs also carry risks of potential issues with either the keyboard kit itself, manufacturer miscommunication, and so on. There's an experimental nature to prototype runs, just as the name suggests, and while it's less of an issue if the designer or prototype runner is trustworthy, just know that you should carefully consider whether the project is worth your support, be it with your time or your money. I do not suggest joining if you have even an ounce of trepidation, and while you may not be able to have every question answered by the designer or prototype runner, you should, at the very least, ask questions and feel comfortable before considering joining. After all, the keyboard hobby is a luxury hobby, and I don't mean that in terms of how much keyboards cost necessarily, although prototype units sometimes cost more because of the smaller MOQs, but the fact that it's not a need when it comes to other things in life. Sure, if you join the hobby solely for ergonomic reasons and you rely on typing to sustain yourself financially, buying a custom keyboard that is ergonomically better than your current board may be a need, but for the majority of us, we don't need to buy mechanical keyboards to function, let alone joining a prototype run for a board. So, as always, make sure you're able to financially afford a prototype board, understand the risks, and carefully research if it's something you're willing to take a chance on when it comes to the board itself as well as the designer. And don't have FOMO. There is absolutely nothing wrong with waiting to see if a public run will happen, and oftentimes, the public run will have improved units versus the prototype units. Or, there may be situations where the designer just makes a bunch of prototype units and sells them as in-stock units. That's how I picked up my Jixty 60 keyboards, and how my friend picked up his Plaque 80 keyboard, which were all prototypes from Paramount Keyb. You can do everything in your power to be confident in your decision to join a proto run, and the designer and prototype runner could also be the perfect person for the role, but what happens if the manufacturer messes up, or doesn't agree to fully fix the issue? Will you still be happy with your unit with a few cosmetic flaws or issues? Even if everything is handled correctly on your end and the designer's end, there are external factors that can affect how the unit arrives at your doorstep. So know that there will always be an inherent risk, even if you and the designer have set the project up for success. And again, don't feel like you're missing out. Just because you didn't buy the unit doesn't mean you can't help support the designer or a project in other ways, such as word-of-mouth advertising, assisting by asking questions, or simply talking with the designer and other interested enthusiasts like yourself. While it can be helpful to have a physical unit to tinker with, just because you didn't buy a prototype unit doesn't mean that you can't give valuable advice or ask questions that will benefit future runs of the board, or help the designer in general. I feel like we see the journey of keyboard newbies, someone who's just joined the hobby, to keyboard enthusiasts, someone who's decided that they're interested in learning more about the hobby and being active in the hobby, to keyboard designers, from many designers in our hobby. It does seem kind of like a natural progression, even though obviously not everyone becomes a keyboard designer, because one can gain immense satisfaction by designing ideas or things that they want based on their own preferences, and then attempting to bring that dream to life. After all, it's called custom keyboards, right? That's also how group buys started in our hobby. Although it isn't a new concept, it's become somewhat synonymous with the hobby. Someone has a very cool idea, they reach out to the community to see if anyone else thinks that the idea is cool, then they gain interest of those individuals, tweaking their idea here and there, and then, as a group, join the buy, sometimes resulting in lower prices versus just buying one-offs if a minimum order quantity is met to achieve said discount. It doesn't have to be designing something either. It could simply be, hey, I want to buy this item. Does anybody else want to buy this item? If a lot of us join and purchase it as a group, we can get discounted rates versus us buying the item separately. Somewhere along the line, we've seen the evolution of, oh, this is cool. Do you think this is cool? Let's buy this thing together. Mindset of passionate designers to, not only can we make cool things, but we can make a little bit of a profit while doing so. And that's not necessarily bad, and this video isn't necessarily going in depth about the history of group buys, or if we've lost a bit of that magical childlike wonder of those early days of not only finding group buys but joining them, but it's very easy to see the progression of the hobby and collective buying, aka group buys, as a whole. From a designer who thinks they have a great idea and wants to share that idea with the rest of the community, to creating prototypes after fine-tuning their interest check or what they're trying to achieve, is pretty inspiring. Endless possibilities, following your passion and creating a project that you truly love and have put your heart and soul into, and even through all the difficult hours spent figuring out the entire process, putting yourself out there, creating and realizing your dreams in terms of keyboard designs can make the process of keyboard designing somewhat poetic. It's beautiful when you think about it, and I can honestly understand why designers design. Or at least, I have a somewhat romanticized idea of designing things. And another reason why I truly believe that this community is the best part of the hobby is because without the community, it would be hard to get any sort of group buy or successful IC or project up and running. Supporting designers becomes less about giving money to a faceless name or an alias on the internet, but it's about helping your friends who end up becoming designers once they get far enough into the rabbit hole of keyboards. At least that's what I've experienced with two designers that I mention regularly and whose prototype boards that I've been waiting to arrive to make this video, James and Thebloodyez. If you ask both of them how they became designers, you'll get stories about them joining the hobby, then slowly getting more and more ingrained into the community, and eventually getting that itch to create something themselves, and to share those cool projects with us, the community. What started as just two acquaintances turned into friends, and it ended up with me supporting their projects when they took that step to become designers. And just like with your loved ones, you want to do anything and everything you can to help your friends and family succeed and achieve their dreams. Obviously, there'll be hard and difficult times for sure, but to those that you truly call friends, against all odds, you root for them and you wish them the best, and you support them in any way you can. Because at the end of the day, supporting prototype runs of their project is simply being a good friend. I think that the purest form of happiness and enjoyment in this hobby is supporting your friends who become designers, or designers who have become your friends. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with buying keyboards from companies, brands, or designers that you don't have a relationship with, since we enjoy the hobby in our own different ways. But it's just something magical about supporting fellow community members who are your friends by either joining a prototype run for their boards, or just offering to help, or give valuable feedback without necessarily needing to support them monetarily. It doesn't have to be prototype runs alone either. For example, any keycap set that I can afford from James or Bloody, I'm all in for it and fully support. JCS Arabic, Keycobos Gadada Neo, whatever it is. I'll be more than happy to help them and to help them hit MOQ when I can. But let's get back to proto boards and the second reason why I love joining prototype runs, providing valuable feedback. All I want to do is help. And when it comes to keyboard designers, for instance, I don't mind recording hundreds of hours of footage, editing videos, and staying up until 5 a.m. to make sure the renders and uploads went through. Why? Because they're my friends. If I can provide valuable feedback to not only them, but by doing so, help future buyers of the keyboard projects they've been working on, especially if that feedback can be implemented into the eventual public group buy with the production units and make the overall project better, then I'm happy. It's a good idea to get prototype units in the hands of those that can give their thoughts to designers, because while a designer thinks that they may have gone over every nook and cranny of a keyboard, we see things differently through various lenses. Think of how just about any successful group of people or organizations have a variety of people and different perspectives that others bring in. Because you can't even begin to experience all that life has to offer by your own, and relying on others to use their talents, skills, experiences, and opinions can create an end product that far exceeds something that can be created just by your own experiences. Sometimes we can overlook things that are right under our nose as well. Now, this doesn't mean that a designer has to appeal to everyone, or veer so far from their original design or idea that it's no longer something that they're passionate about or want to create, but truly valuable feedback can potentially improve an initial design while still being an end product that the designer enjoys and still captures their vision of said project. For example, the QFRL 100 prototype by Thebloodyez. I recorded a few sound tests and a review video, and I caught something that the other prototype run joiners as well as Bloody did not experience. While it's obviously not widespread, since I don't think anyone else had this issue, I experienced that in its bottom mount configuration, it accentuated desk noise, and it also reminded me of Geon's Frog TKL and other Geon boards that have those long horizontal feet that give off that desk noise, that rumbly tone. For some reason, those boards give off that rumbly sound on top of my desk, which is something that others may want to know because that's something that many Geon horizontal feet board enjoyers experience as well. For the QFRL, it's definitely not a feet issue because it uses differently designed feet, and even though it could be a negative regarding the QFRL 100, because we all have different desk setups and hear different things, instead of a potential buyer experiencing this issue once they receive the board when it goes into the public group buy stage, at least they'll be aware of it. Or we try and figure out what's causing the issue and either bring up some alternatives to fix it, or possibly adjust the design prior to the public group buy run. Not every single person who has similarly designed Geon boards using those horizontal feet experienced the issue, since not everyone has the same typing surface or setup, and not everyone thinks it's a big issue. But it was enough of a known issue, with quotation marks, that people figured out ways to fix the issue, with one designer even attempting to run a group buy for a modified feet design, or other people saying to remove the front feet. Did this result in the Frog TKL or other similarly designed Geon boards losing value? Well, for some people it did, but in my opinion, and the opinions of many others, the pros of those boards far outweigh the cons. But even though it might have ended up being a reason why people don't buy those boards, at least they were informed prior to buying. The same concept applies to the QFRL 100. In my opinion, for the minority that may encounter the same issue, the pros of the board far outweigh the cons. And at least people will know that it may be an issue if we can't figure out a fix, which is better than a buyer being surprised and potentially angry after buying the board and finding out after they've spent hundreds of dollars on the board. Or, again, because of finding out about the issue, we figure out a mod to fix it, or potentially tweak it, which is why it can be helpful to not only buy into a prototype run, but to get the protos in the hands of as many people as possible without negatively impacting the designer too much financially. In essence, we were kind of the guinea pigs, and while that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile to join a prototype run, or that a board is bad by any means, it is indeed what the word prototype means, and why there are prototype runs before public or full-on group buys, or an in-stock sale. In the case of the K3 from James, a few of us private run, prototype run enjoyers realized that while top mount was an option, the board seemed to be more tuned for gasket mount, both either plateless or with a PC plate option. For some of us, including me, the screws didn't completely match up with the top mount screw holes, but like with the QFRL, the pros far outweighed these cons. Giving valuable feedback doesn't have to be all negative either. For example, letting a designer know how great they implemented the design is helpful as well. With the QFRL 100, the fact that it was not only a top mount, but bottom mount, and that the implementation was done so well, resulted in my favorite typing feel, which was super bouncy of any board that I've tried, including the ARC-60 Plateless. And that feedback can result in Bloody continuing to implement it throughout his designs, knowing that it works very well. And figuring out what works and what doesn't is extremely important when it comes to designing boards and what the community wants. I'm not a designer by any means, so imagine what feedback another actual designer could give, or someone that's more experienced in reviewing keyboards, to either James or Bloody, which is why it's nice to get the units out to not only common people like me, but those that have experiences reviewing boards or designing them. Which brings me to reason number 3 why I enjoy prototype runs. Unique units. Am I a bad person if I like the idea of exclusivity? Well, I asked myself this when I first started learning about prototype keys. If there's only a small amount of units that are made, possibly in an exclusive colorway, or have some internal engravings, or something that's meaningful to those that join the prototype run, would that cause FOMO? Or, while extremely unlikely, higher prices if those protos are sold on the aftermarket versus the public run units, especially if the board never makes it to public run. Yeah, sure, that's true. However, I'd argue that for the most part, designers who offer prototype runs and those who join them do so for relatively harmless reasons and not because of FOMO or selling prototypes for a profit. No matter what, a prototype unit will have to be created, either just for the designer's personal use and to test things, or opened up for those that want to join. It's not advised to design a keyboard and then go straight into selling them publicly without any sort of research or development or actual units made to test. A colorway that won't be offered for a public group buy, or an engraving that's funny or gives a nod to those who helped support the project by joining the prototype run is a nice touch. Honestly, for me, I just want to help. But as a small thank you of sorts, I understand why it happens. Sometimes supporters get some sort of acknowledgement as thanks for their help, which is why some YouTube channels show off their names of their Patreon members, or YouTube membership members, or Twitch streamers who give subscribers custom badges, and so on. A lot of the supporters don't do it for any benefit besides helping, but it is a nice touch when they are acknowledged. The fact that most prototype runs allow anyone to join who's willing to pay also doesn't mean that there's only a small few that have the chance to join either. And those runs don't necessarily restrict anyone from joining as long as they're able to put forth the money for a prototype unit. And for the most part, those who buy proto units don't do it to sell it on the aftermarket, so it's less of an issue. And besides, if a public run does happen, chances are those public units have significant improvements over the prototype units. And boards that have an issue with exclusivity driving up their prices on the aftermarket usually don't offer prototype units in the first place. TGR, Singa, Keycap, for example. I believe that there's nothing inherently wrong about a prototype run of a board offering a colorway or a little engraving as thanks to a supporter, especially if that prototype run is offered to anyone who wants to join versus restricting the number of units made. As we've learned with MOQ, the more people that buy into something, the cheaper it can be. It's not always the case, but just in general. A one-off or just 2 or 3 boards will cost more for those individuals than a manufacturer making 10 or more units of those protos. Also, like I mentioned with the Plaque 80 and the Jix D60, sometimes prototype units are sold after the fact as in-stock units, which is a nice touch for those that want to buy a prototype unit but want them in stock. Some prototype units have cosmetic flaws, or some sort of quirk that usually allows them to still be functional, but maybe not someone that specifically goes out to buy them and sell them at a higher cost on the aftermarket usually is focused on. Or a prototype might work, but instead of selling units, the designer decides to open source the entire project so that anyone willing to source the parts can build one, such as the Toad. Designers who open source their projects are truly some of the most passionate and kind enthusiasts in our hobby. I don't think that wanting to join a prototype run and getting an exclusive colorway or an engraving as a way of saying thanks is necessarily a bad thing. Protos have to be made no matter what, and a lot of times, proto runs are open to the general public, so whoever wants to join can join. Just like in life, there are no guarantees when it comes to prototype runs, however, which is what I'll talk about in the next portion of this video, the cons of joining a prototype run. After taking a few pictures of the Migra TKL for Bloody, he asked me what this weird discoloration in the eye portion of the front of the keyboard was. At first, I thought it was just dirt or dust, but when I took a picture with my digital microscope, I could see that it was actual damage, or maybe corrosion? Anyways, something that the manufacturer overlooked. The Migra TKL is the most beautiful board that I've ever seen or had my hands on, which is obviously subjective, but it's my opinion. And even though this cosmetic flaw wasn't enough for me to change this opinion, the fact that the manufacturer stated that it was acceptable did not sit well with Bloody, as well as some other issues, but I won't get into specifics. Sometimes, even if the designer does their best to let the manufacturer know what's acceptable or not, depending on a myriad of reasons, a factory may deem something as acceptable when, in fact, it isn't in the designer's eyes. What happens then? Well, if the designer has a good relationship with the manufacturer, or at the very least the manufacturer is willing to talk about it, perhaps the manufacturer will remake the units if it's egregious enough, or partially refund the designer. who in turn sends you that refund for the damage. Or may just shrug and say, "We deem it as acceptable, sorry." Most of the time, that last scenario doesn't happen, as the keyboard community and designer community are very tight-knit, and a bad experience or a recommendation not to go with a specific keyboard manufacturer can be damaging to that manufacturer's reputation, even though they focus on other non-keyboard related products. However, it's a very real possibility that for prototype runs, there will be cosmetic issues, or screw holes not being the right size, or tolerances of the case not being in spec, or even PCB issues. Sometimes the entire kit is still functional, while other times it's not. Generally, however, most proto runs nowadays will at least be of usable units, albeit with a few cosmetic or other quirks. But you never know until the unit is received, QC'd by the designer or whomever they entrust the QCing to, and arrives at your doorstep. Just like in life, there are no guarantees. I doubt that Bloody or James would allow a non-functional unit to reach our doorsteps, and they do anything and everything in their power to make things right, even at their own cost, because that's just who they are. But do know that not every designer or person in charge of a prototype run will do the same. As we've seen with many designers and vendors, the keyboard community is not immune to exit scamming or other issues that leave those that bought keycaps, keyboards, or even artisans high and dry. Proceed with caution, because at the end of the day, it's your wallet, and it's your decision to make when it comes to joining prototype runs. Obviously, that would never happen with Bloody or James, but I can't speak for every other designer. I would feel horrible if you decide to join a prototype run after watching this video and end up getting scammed, and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, so I urge you to please consider the pros and the cons before joining a prototype run. Being able to financially afford it and doing your homework is important, not just with prototype runs, and not just with this hobby, but in life. Well, what do you think? After weighing the pros and cons and understanding the risks associated with joining a prototype run for a keyboard, would you still be interested? Again, that's a question you're going to have to ask yourself, since each situation of where a prototype run may be offered can be different. But personally, I'm confident in your ability to make an informed decision versus impulsively doing so. I love this hobby, the community, and supporting my friends and designers, and I think that supporting a designer by joining a prototype run is extremely satisfying, but I also know that it's not for everyone, and that's fine. Please do not have FOMO, and remember, there will always be another keyboard or prototype run, and more often than not, if a prototype run leads to a public run, you'll be able to buy a production unit. I hope this video has been helpful, and that you understand why I love joining proto runs. To support the designer, to give valuable feedback, and to have somewhat of a unique board. And I'd love to hear your comments on the matter. I hope everyone is enjoying their New Year's, and I hope that you all have a great start to 2025. And hey, maybe consider keeping tabs on your favorite designer's Discord channel for potential prototype run opportunities, whether you help out monetarily by actually buying into the prototype run, or just help out with useful advice or conversations or questions. Thanks again. I love you all, and see you next time.